And it happened one day that he was teaching the people in the temple, and while preaching, the chief priests and scribes with the elders came upon him suddenly and said, speaking to him, "Tell us by what authority you do these things, or who it is that gave you this authority." And answering them, he said, "I will likewise ask you all a question. Tell me, was the baptism of John from heaven or from man?" And they discussed among themselves, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why did you not believe him?' But if we say from man, all the people will stone us to death, for they are convinced that John was a prophet." So they answered that they did not know from where. And Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." The authority of Jesus, we're just going to stop here for a few moments. So Jesus is teaching the people. He's doing what he ordinarily does. He's taking an opportunity to teach as many people as he can. And these religious leaders, the chief priests, the scribes, with the elders, just basically everybody, they all come up, and it says they come upon him suddenly, right? That this was not something that was necessarily expected, though I'm certain Jesus expected it, given omniscience and all. But they come upon him suddenly, and they ask by what authority Jesus is doing these things that he's doing, and by what authority, or who gave him that said authority. And you'd think this would just be, well, Jesus just says, well, I'm doing this by the authority of my Father in heaven. Yet this is used as a teaching opportunity. Look at what he proceeds to do in verse 3. "I will likewise ask you all a question. Tell me," verse 4, "was the baptism of John from heaven or from man?" Now, for someone who isn't skeptical of Jesus, we just say from heaven. We recognize that from John 1:27 that John the Baptist preceded Jesus in his ministry, and as such, he was supposed to be proclaiming to them the words of Jesus, the fact that Jesus was coming to them, and that they were supposed to listen to Jesus, the Son of God. But there were many who did not feel that way. Right? And so Jesus is alluding back to that fact of unbelief that many of the religious people had towards John and now towards Jesus, and he's using that against them quite skillfully. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? And they immediately see the conundrum, the chief priests, the scribes, the elders. They see the logical puzzle that they're stuck in now. Not because the question itself is puzzling, but because to answer the question properly and honestly, while also maintaining their appearance before people, that's hard to do both at the same time. And of course, we would say that it doesn't matter what other people think of you, but when you're concerned about putting on a show and showboating before others, putting on a front, that can really conflict with your perception of the truth. And that's exactly what happens here. They discuss among themselves, verse 5, if we say that baptism was from heaven, if we say that John's teaching and his baptism were from heaven, then Jesus is just going to say, why did you not believe him? If you really thought that what you were hearing was from God, then why didn't you care enough to actually believe what he was saying? Then in verse 6, but if we say from man, all the people will stone us to death. Now, we were certainly talking about social perception, and I would certainly say that being stoned to death is a little more dire than social perception. But let's say that it really were the case that the people stoned them to death. By the Mosaic law, it would not be completely unjust for them to do so. They are denying the words of someone who came as a prophet. Right? John the Baptist had this authority to say and do the things that he was saying and doing. And for these religious leaders to go against that and to outright verbally oppose that, that's a problem, right? And so they're saying this, and their reason for it is these people, they are convinced that John is a prophet. Well, yeah, he was a prophet. That is indeed what he was. But for them, again, that's not their perception of the situation. So once again, these religious leaders, they're trying to both answer the question, and frankly, I think they know what the answer is. They're trying to answer the question while also staying face in front of people. And that just gets complicated. Verse 7, so they answered that they did not know from where. And we're just left with the I suppose, to question ourselves, was it really that they didn't know from where? Or was it that they didn't know how to answer the question in a way that would be pleasing to their own sensibilities and their own perceptions? I think that might be more so what's happening here. And Jesus responds thus, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." Verse 8, if you're not going to answer my simple question, I'm not going to answer your simple question. These questions were not hard. Jesus wasn't stumped here. He isn't thinking the same thing that they're thinking. I mean, really, consider this. The way that the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders considered this question in verses 5 and 6 is they basically said, if we say from heaven, Jesus is going to question us. If we say from man, the people aren't going to like us. Note that that is not what Jesus did with the question that the chief priests, scribes, and elders asked him. He didn't say, well, if I say that my authority is from God, then the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders are not going to like me very much. But if I say that my authority is of myself, then certainly I'd be put to death. He isn't thinking all of that because, number one, that message is from God. He has literally nothing to hide or to be ashamed of. But he's not ultimately concerned with how people look at him. He's not concerned with staying face in front of people who don't truly care about spiritual things. These religious leaders showcase a duality that is by no means holy. It's a duality that really just shows nothing more than craftiness. It shows, I think the appropriate phrase would be, at least in my mind, intellectual dishonesty. It's you are intentionally avoiding the clear answer to questions because it's inconvenient. And that's what these religious leaders are seeming to be doing. It's a denial of religious truth for the sake of appearance. Yes, sir?
The last time I read this, it struck me, he's not avoiding their question. He's not saying, answer this one first, because the answer to his question is the same one. And the only reason they're asking him about his authority is because they reject where they know it's from, just like they rejected it John.
Exactly. This is not Jesus saying like, oh man, this is hard. I gotta buy some time. That isn't what's happening. He's saying you didn't agree with what John was saying. You didn't appreciate him and his teaching. You're not appreciating me either. So I'm not gonna just give into your ploy here, right? There's a lot of plotting that's happening here against Jesus, and he's not falling for it. Anyone else on that? Yes.
I was just thinking sometimes people who are confident or have some measure of authority feel threatened by people who seem to be more confident or have more authority.
Mm-hmm. Right. Is my trust in the fact, or is my faith in the fact that God has all authority, or is really my faith in the fact that I, or any one of us asking this question to ourselves, that I have some measure of authority or religious knowledge or things like that, and if my ultimate trust is in myself to have all the answers and to be self-sufficient, there's going to be someone else who is better than me. That always seems to be the principle. And what's going to happen? Everything around me is going to crumble. But if my faith is in God as the only one who knows all things and the only one who's fully worth trusting, that's not going to happen. Right? That's absolutely right. It's absolutely right. I always appreciate that old maxim because I think it's always true that there is always someone better than you. No matter what it is you think you're proficient at, there is always someone who would absolutely leave you in the dust if you had a competition. That should be humbling. And even if you were the best in the world at something, there's God. It's hard. Not even nigh impossible. It is impossible to compete with God, especially in knowledge. Anyone else on that? Okay. So again, these people, they are denying religious truth just as they did against John the Baptist. They're doing this now with Jesus. And Jesus, as we're going to look on in verses 9 through 17 in the subsequent parable, this is really something that they've done with all the prophets. And that's going to be one of the main points that's brought up there. But just note as well, go back to verse 1 for a second. One day that he was teaching the people in the temple. What you're going to frequently find in this chapter, and I think this has been a common theme throughout Luke 18 and 19 as well, is that the people, the common people, they believe, they understand. they are willing to humbly accept what Jesus is saying to them, and yet it's these religious elites, right, quote unquote. The religious elites did not, because their pride was going to be shattered. And so to not believe John was to not believe in Jesus, because John preceded him. He made that point very clear. Let's look in verses 9 through 17, continuing this point about the authority of Jesus. It was spelled out rather explicitly in verses 1 through 8 that there's some authority that Jesus has that these people are questioning, or at least they're just trying to entrap him in his words. But this is going to really put a fine point on what's really going on in the hearts of these religious leaders. So let's read from verse 9. And he began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and leased it to tenant farmers or vine dressers and went on a journey for a long time. And at the proper time, he sent a servant to the tenant farmers in order that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. And the tenant farmers beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he proceeded to send another servant. But they also beat this one and dishonored him and sent him away empty-handed. And he proceeded to send a third. But they also wounded this one and threw him out. And the master of the vineyard said, "What should I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenant farmers saw him, they plotted among themselves, saying, "This is the heir. Let us kill him in order that the inheritance may belong to us." And they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, what will the master of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy these tenant farmers, and he will give the vineyard to others. Let's actually just stop there now that I'm really thinking about it. We ought to stop there because then the response from the people is going to follow that. So he's telling them this parable. This man plants a vineyard. He leases it to these tenant farmers, and he leaves for a long time. Have you noticed over these past few weeks how many of these parables involve this master of some kind? He is giving some measure of responsibility to servants or slaves, and he leaves for a certain amount of time. Do you notice how frequently that pattern is found in a lot of these parables we've studied these past few weeks? There is something that we ought not ignore there. So often the question is posed, well, how can I believe in a God, and how can I obey a God, trust in a God who I can't see? And yet parables like this one seem to point out it doesn't matter. Because what God is showing us is that we've been tasked with work. We've been tasked to, through Jesus, repent of those misdeeds under which we've been enslaved, and to be better people, to lead others to Jesus Christ, to stop our willful sin, and to come into right relationship with God, reflecting God as He is the light and walking in Him. We're supposed to do that. But because our master is gone for a long time, we can take that a lot less seriously. It might even remind you of 2 Peter 3 in a way, where it's said in verse 9, the some count slowness. Where is he? I don't see any signs of his coming. Where in the world is our Lord? That time is being given for people to repent, and then it's going to happen. In the same way in Noah's day, when after 120 years of Noah's preaching, the rain started falling, could they plead, "Give me more time"? No, they couldn't. I really want you to just recognize that pattern in how these parables are set up. There's a master, he gives a job to the servants or to the slaves, and he leaves. Let's go on to verse 10. And at the proper time, he sent a servant to the tenant farmers in order that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. So again, he sends a servant to these tenant farmers in order to see what they've been up to. That's, again, another common theme, that eventually there's some type of accountability here, right? And so that this master can have some of the fruit that's been planted. Do the tenant farmers accept the servant? They say, "Hey, it's so good to see you. Here's some of the things we've been working on. Here's some of the amazing fruit that we've made." No, the tenant farmers beat him and they send him away empty-handed. They do no good service to their master. Verse 11, he proceeded to send another servant, but they also beat this one and dishonored him. That's significant. Remember that in Greco-Roman culture, it is very much a guilt, shame type culture, to dishonor someone, to shame someone, that's a big deal. That's just showing the most flippant of disrespect to an individual, and that's exactly what they did to this servant. And not only did they beat him, not only did they dishonor him, they send him away, likewise empty-handed. Okay, certainly third time's the charm, right? Look in verse 12. He proceeded to send a third, but they also wounded this one and threw him out. And the master of the vineyard said, what should I do? I've sent 3 servants, and these tenant farmers, they don't care. They keep on beating these people. They keep on throwing them out. There must be something that I can do. And he has this idea to send his own son, his beloved son, he says. Perhaps they will respect him. But instead of rejoicing when they saw the son, they instead plotted. Verse 14. They're thinking to themselves, this is the heir, let's kill him in order that the inheritance may belong to us instead of the son. And they throw him out of the vineyard and they kill him. Now, what will the master of the vineyard do to them? What do you think? He sent these 3 servants, and now he sent his son, and they killed his son. What do we think, in our common sense reading, is going to happen to these people? Verse 16, he will come and destroy, or he will kill these tenant farmers, and he will give the vineyard to others. And when they heard this, the people, they say, may it never be. Verse 17, and he looked at them and said, what then is this that was written? The stone that the builders rejected, this became the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be crushed. Anyone on whom it falls will be destroyed. He is pointing this parable right back at them. You may remember in 2 Samuel 12 when Nathan the prophet delivers this story about this person who really just took a lot of things for granted and used what this other person had to his own satisfaction. And David is thinking, well, this is awful. This person should be sentenced to death. And can anyone tell me what Nathan said to him? Right. You are the man. Not positively. It's not you're the man. No. You are the man. You are the one who is guilty. The same person that you are condemning in this parable that I've told, you're that person. In a similar way, that's what Jesus is doing with this parable. He's saying that if you're so outraged about the master of this vineyard's son being killed, his 3 servants being killed, if you're so outraged about that, why can't you recognize you're doing the exact same thing? And that's where this quotation comes in. The stone that the builders rejected, this became the cornerstone. The psalm is telling us everything that we need to know. The builders rejected, the very people who are trying to build this structure. I suppose we can understand it's like religious structure here. I suppose we're trying to literalize this. The very people who should have used that stone and used it wisely, should have not taken it for granted, that stone became the cornerstone. The one that they cared nothing about. And everyone who falls on that stone will be crushed. So you remember in the parable, he will come and destroy those tenant farmers. Everyone who falls on that stone will be crushed. Anyone on whom it falls will be destroyed. Hebrews 10:26-29 has some very strong language about this type of thing. It says how much worse a punishment, in essence, how much worse do you think it's going to be for people who have trampled underfoot the Son of God, have outraged the Spirit of grace? There's this thought in the religious world that we have it easy now. That, yeah, in the Old Testament it was all about just strict obedience and precision obedience and all these different things. But now it's all about grace. It doesn't matter if you can follow everything. I think there's truth in the fact that there is grace, We ought to be thankful for that grace and to recognize our own shortcomings and our own propensity to fall under those shortcomings. However, what the Hebrews writer makes very clear in those verses is that you think that you have it easier because Jesus has come, but you actually have it harder. The standard by which we are going to be judged, the text says, is harsher. And that is absolutely fair for God to do. He has given every opportunity. Look at verse 19. And the scribes and the chief priests sought to lay their hands on him that same hour, but they feared the people, for they knew that this parable was spoken against them. Luke wants to make it very explicit in case any of us missed it while we were reading. The parable was about them. They themselves were disrespecting the authority of Jesus Christ. The people of God, the Jews, for a lot of this, the Hebrew people really, they disrespected and they mistreated every prophet that came. So many narratives in the Old Testament are told of prophets who proclaimed bad news against them. And they were like, I don't want to hear any of that. What can we do to silence him? Pretty much. Now they're doing the exact same thing with Jesus, just as they did the same thing with John, as we just talked about a few minutes ago. And in a similar way that these tenant farmers plot to kill the beloved son, these religious leaders, they're plotting to do the same. And we, of course, know that's exactly what they would go on to do. But they plot to kill the son. And you notice in the parable, it's to have what the son is going to have. I don't know exactly the connection, but I think at least part of it is this religious power and influence from the Father. They want to please the Father. They think they're doing things correctly. When they put Jesus on that cross, I bet you they're thinking, we're doing the right thing here. Otherwise, why is it such a shock? Why does it pierce their hearts when Peter says, no, you crucified the Son of God? Everything that they did, when you really look at it, you look at, say, Matthew 23 with all the woes that are given unto them. Let me not say all, but much of what they did was motivated by pride. And Jesus, to them, was not the Son of God bringing teaching to them that can save their souls. He's not the person who is the gospel himself, the person who alone can free mankind from their willful sins. No, he's a threat to our power, to our authority, for us to have our little puppeteering power over people's souls. If this guy keeps on going, we don't have that anymore. And we've got to silence him. Let's move on to the wisdom of Jesus. The wisdom of Jesus, verses 19 through 40 here. Or really, I meant to put verses 20 through 40, but that's okay. And they observed him and sent spies, themselves pretending to be righteous, in order that they might catch him in something he said, in order to hand him over to the power and authority of the governor. And they asked him, saying, Teacher, we know that you speak and teach correctly and do not show partiality, but you truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay tax to Caesar or not? And he noticed their craftiness and said to them, Show me a denarius. Who has its likeness and inscription? And they said, Caesar. And he said to them, Well then, pay Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. They were unable to catch him in even a word before the people, and they marveled at his answer and became silent. Quickly going through this, I don't want this to be all that I emphasize here, but they are really buttering Jesus up here. Right? Note again, themselves pretending to be righteous. They made themselves appear righteous in order that they might catch him in something that he said, right? So that they can just hand him over to the governor after that. And these are all things that, funnily enough, are true. It's often the case that the only time they said things that were accurate about Jesus were when they were trying to fake it. And yet those are the moments that they got it right. We know that you speak and teach correctly and do not show partiality, but you truly teach the way of God. If it wasn't for their attitude, I might give them a standing ovation because they actually said something right. but they didn't have the right heart for it. So when they ask, is it lawful to pay tax to Caesar or not? This is not some zealous individual who's like, I'm just really thinking about this, and I know that there are some of our people who are tax collectors, and that's really harming the people of God, and I just don't know if we in our conscience should be paying taxes to these people. No. That's not, they don't care about that. Because once again, if Jesus says, don't pay taxes, okay, well now they can hand him over to the governor, right? Because now we're talking about putting the government in financial risk. But if he says, yes, you should pay your taxes, just that directly, then guess what? The Jews can sit there and think, well, why would you support something that is actively harming our people, that some of us, Matthew was a tax collector, for example, that some of us are using to harm our people? This is another attempted conundrum that they're wanting to put Jesus in, but it doesn't work. Just look at the way that he answers. And he noticed their craftiness, verse 23. So all of this he's about to say, he knows what they're up to. The way that I heard it growing up is that he is he's on the okie doke, I think was how I heard it. He is fully aware that something is not right. And he's aware of their craftiness. He says to them, show me a denarius. Who has its likeness and its inscription? And they said, Caesar. Okay, so I see this denarius. It has Caesar's inscription. Okay, great. And then he says, well, you see his inscription there. It's Caesar's likeness, isn't it? So pay Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. It's a simple and pointed answer that, yes, before I neglect this, yes, Christians are supposed to pay our taxes. It's a direct command from Jesus. Romans 13, Paul repeats the same point. It is unequivocally true. We are supposed to pay our taxes. You can't get around that. But that's not the point here, I don't think, either. When you're trying to put Jesus at odds with or conflate Jesus with the government, good or bad, the party you like or don't like, whatever, it is a bad idea. Terrible idea. Doesn't Jesus later say that my kingdom is not of this world? I'm certainly not saying that we shouldn't be in some way concerned about the affairs of man and what's happening on this earth. Don't mishear me. But what I am saying is that there is great error that takes place everywhere on the political spectrum, everywhere on the religious spectrum. When I try to say that Jesus checks all these boxes, or that he, in flippance towards the people, is at odds with checking these boxes, it's not a wise thing to do. And if we're not careful, we certainly don't have the ability to have Jesus sent away by the government, but we are in some way putting him at the mercy of the public when we misuse his name and his teachings in that way. I ought not elaborate on that, but just I'd ask you to think about that. And I want you to just notice in verse 26, just bluntly, that his answer shut them up. That was it. They were unable to catch him in even a word before the people, and they marveled at his answer and became silent. They were doing a lot of this, and they started doing this, because this answer was so profound to them. Let's move on to verses 27 through 39 here. And some of the Sadducees approached him, those who say there is no resurrection, and they asked him, saying, Teacher, Moses wrote to us, if someone's brother dies, having a wife, and this wife is childless, that his brother should take the wife and raise up offspring for his brother. Now, there were 7 brothers. And the first took a wife and died childless, and the second and the third took her, and likewise the 7 died, and did not leave any children behind. And finally, the woman died. Now, whose wife will the woman be in the resurrection? For the 7 have her as their wife. I want to stop here and say, the Sadducees really thought they were cooking something up with this one. You see, they didn't believe in the resurrection. They were skeptics about the resurrection. And the funny thing about a skeptic is that all that a skeptic needs is to not believe something. They're not expected to have proof, like those of us who are trying to defend a position. They can just say, I don't believe in this. Do you have any evidence for this? Okay, here's a hypothetical scenario that is completely unlikely to happen. Do you have any actual evidence for that? Not really, but should it matter? I'm not trying to create a caricature of every skeptic that's out there. That's certainly not a universal picture, but we see this passage all the time, I think, and maybe for us, we just look at this and it's like, it's a silly scenario at the end of the day. You can see what they're trying to do, from my understanding. They're quoting Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10, or they're at least trying to paraphrase it. But Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10 was not written as a cop-out for teaching about the resurrection. It wasn't written for that. It was written to defend the widow. It was written to make sure that she has safe people, which you would hope family members would certainly be, to take care of her and to retain the legacy of that fallen brother. It wasn't some thought of, oh, well, eventually the Sadducees can use this to argue against the resurrection. No. What's funny about this whole scenario is that the Sadducees didn't even understand why those verses were there to begin with. They misapplied them in trying to catch Jesus in his words. It's foolish. And again, they paint this scenario and they ultimately are trying to say, well, this woman's got to be married to somebody. And if there's a resurrection, then you need to be able to answer the question of who exactly she is married to. So who's she married to, Jesus? Look at what he says in verse 34. The sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those considered worthy to attain to that age and the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage. For they are no longer able to die, for they are like angels and are children of God, being sons of the resurrection. And that the dead are raised, even Moses showed this in the passage about the thorn bush, when he said, the Lord is the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. And God is not of the dead, but of the living, for all are alive to him. Some of the scribes answered and said, Teacher, you have spoken well. For they no longer dare to ask him anything. There's a lot that Jesus says here. Just breaking some of this down. Verse 34, people in this day and time, and in that time as well, in the direct context of when Jesus is speaking, they marry. They're given in marriage. That's normal. But verse 35 kind of flips that a little bit. He says emphatically, those who attain to that age, those who are considered worthy to attain to that age, and the resurrection from the dead, neither marry nor are given in marriage. It's a fact about heaven that we don't talk about a whole lot, but just bluntly, yeah, it kind of is a difficult thing for me to think about considering recent events in my own life, right? But despite that, Jesus says what he says. And we're left to just wonder, why is this the case? Isn't that just mean? There are several of us who are incredibly happy in the relationships that we're in. Why would it be that in heaven, in this place where we're supposed to be happy, one of the greatest bonds we have is taken away? I'm not saying this is the conclusive answer, but this is where I am currently in my study on this. Remember, they were trying to quote Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10, which was ultimately about protecting the widow. Right? It was about making sure the widow was taken care of, making sure that she was happy and that everything was allowed to her that could be. And the widow in that type of a situation from Deuteronomy 25 is in a very, very precarious position. It's not an easy spot that she's in. And though there are many of us who are very happy in the relationships that we're in, I know there are many of us who are not. I'm not entirely sure, but I think at least a part of it in verse 36 or verse 35 is that this looks out for everybody. Those who were happy in their earthly relationships and those who were not. Those who had very uncomplicated relationships and those who had very complicated relationships. It's a universal rule for everyone to be happy and to simply be joyous in the fact that they are with God now. Yes, sir.
Christy and I have a very good relationship. In heaven, our relationship will not be less than it is now.
Right.
It won't be marriage, but it will be deeper and more meaningful than it is now. But my relationship with God will be even more.
Exactly. That's it. That's it. When you look at many of the passages, like say Ephesians 5, that talks about husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. There is something very special about marriage. If I were, let me put the brakes here and just say if I were asked to give a marriage seminar, I would probably say no for the next 80 years. But what I will say is that many of the ways that you are supposed to treat your spouse, from my understanding, which is limited, is the way that you treat other people as a Christian. You don't have a different set of rules when you're with your wife about anger and grudges and being kind to each other and things like that. You treat people a certain way. And as is being mentioned, the relationship doesn't become any less deep because marriage isn't a thing in heaven. That's not what it is. And I love the way that you said this. It's just that our relationship with God is so much greater. I don't know fully the question, or I don't know at all, let me say, of what exactly we're going to be doing in heaven. I know that we're going to be worshiping a great deal. And I heard it said at one point, well, it would get kind of boring to just worship God all the time. And just, we're being honest, sure, it can certainly come across that way. I know on Sunday mornings alone, it can be difficult to not think about lunch while we're sitting here, right? But have we ever considered that being in the fullness of God's presence just might be enough to quench every hunger and every thirst that we have? Yes?
Just real quick, it's a good study to go back to wine, answer the question of why man and woman. If you look at Genesis 2, God tells us he did not see a helper fit for man. He created one, and that's where we get marriage from. Mm-hmm. When we are in front of God in his presence, we don't need help anymore. Mm-hmm. Something to consider. But taking that study all the way back to the beginning and answering the why question of marriage, that's what the scribes should have been doing. Mm-hmm. It starts there.
Right. Alex made the great point that in Genesis 2, marriage was instituted because we need help. we are insufficient on our own, and yet in heaven that isn't the case anymore. And that's a beautiful thing. This is a verse that frankly I read and I get very emotional, but at the same time I trust that God wouldn't make that be the case if he didn't know what he was doing, right?
KJ,
yes?
I think we that verse pretty much stands for itself, but it's difficult to understand it in our physical context. Mm-hmm. But so now the angels are a spirit being. Some being that can last forever because their bodies are not corruptible. There are no bodies, it's incorruptible.
Right.
So in heaven, in eternity, those who are faithful and die in the Lord will be like that as well. Mm-hmm. So that's a whole different relationship. Now it doesn't say that we don't know each other. But just like you said about eating and drinking, things like that. I don't know. I think all our existence here is going to be so different in heaven and so joyous that I don't think we'll be that concerned about all these other physical things here on the earth.
Right.
Because we'll be totally different. Mm-hmm. We'll be like Jesus.
Right. Do we have a healthy understanding of what it means to be in the presence of God? Well, right now we don't, but one day we will. And as Woodrow's indicating, I likewise have this impression that by the time we get there, every question that we've in jest thought of asking Paul, or every longing that we have, or I've heard the joke, well, I just hope that there's a remote so I can keep up with what our football teams are doing. I'm not entirely sure that we're going to care. As a matter of fact, I'm about at least 100% sure we're not going to care. So let's remember that absolutely. All right, I have 3 minutes. We have a few more verses to go through here. I'm loving the discussion. I really appreciate this so much. So verses 41 through 44. And he said to him, "How do they say that Christ is David's son? For David himself says in the book of Psalms, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit on my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet.' Now David calls him Lord. How is he his son?" You might remember, well, actually, no, we didn't get to blind Bartimaeus because I ran out of time. But in that blind Bartimaeus story in Luke 18, what that narrative tells us is one of the things that Bartimaeus says to Jesus is he says, "Son of David, have mercy on me," right? And that's a very significant thing. When you link that to this, it becomes even more apparent why. What the psalmist is indicating is that the Lord said to my Lord, "Sit on my right hand." But again, this situation that Christ is indicating is, how can the psalmist say that the Christ, that the Messiah, is a son of David? Well, to believe that Jesus is of that Davidic line is to believe a great deal about his identity, and it's to understand a promise that was made about that kingdom that's going to last forever. The identity of Jesus is he is the Messiah, he is the son of David, and that all enemies will be under his feet. And then just quickly, the authenticity of Jesus, verses 45 through 47. While all the people were listening, he said to his disciples, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk in long flowing robes and love greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feast, who eat up widows' houses and, for the sake of appearance, make lengthy prayers. These will receive a more severe punishment." And just to put a fine point on it, the authenticity of Jesus, why this point? Because Jesus doesn't do any of these things. Jesus doesn't wear ostentatious clothing. He doesn't just adore the greetings and being called teacher and rabbi. That's not what he lives for. He doesn't go to sit in the best seats in the synagogues. He goes to sit with those people who have no one else to sit with. He finds the outcasts. That's something that Luke so constantly talks about. Who eat up or rob widows' houses. He doesn't do that. Jesus loves the widow. He wants to take care of the widow. We remember the parable of the persistent widow. He cares about the widow's cause. He cares about the widow's case, right? And for the sake of appearance, make lengthy prayers. Nothing that Jesus did was ostentatious. Nothing that he did was showboating. Nothing that he did was putting on a performance. But people who don't mirror that directly in context, these religious leaders, or the scribes more specifically, people who don't mirror Christ in that way, they will receive a more severe punishment. And I will leave it to you to understand what that means. Thank you all for your time.